So tonight we have our guest speaker, Kunal Taravade. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. All the way from US. Kunal works for a software company in Portland, Oregon, in the field of computer chip design. He is the author of many scientific papers and holds over 25 US patents. What makes for a life of purpose? How to pursue or purpose with persistence? Is it possible for one person to make a difference in the world? In his speech, Kunal will tackle these questions through the story of a 19th century reformer in India who used his vision, passion, and determination to bring about immense social, cultural, and religious change across many generations. With a speech entitled A Purposeful Life, please help me welcome Kunal Taravade.
What makes for a life of meaning, value, and purpose? Let us embark on a journey to learn about one very remarkable person. In the shadow of the great Gothic cathedral in the city of Bristol, England, is a strange sight. There's a statue, but not of a medieval saint or a monarch, but of a man from 19th century India, dressed in traditional clothes, carrying a book. This is the statue of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And how this came to be here in this very unusual and unlikely place is the story that we are about to unravel. At the time of his birth, in the middle of the 18th century, India was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, states, provinces, ruled by kings, princes, nawabs, all owing loyalty and allegiance to the Mughal emperor in Delhi, the dynasty that had ruled India for the previous 600 years. The British East India Company that was formed to trade with India was at this time acquiring territorial possessions in India to gain greater control over the places from which they traded. In one such transaction, the Nawab of the province of Bengal in the eastern part of India ceded his territory to the East India Company, as shown in this famous painting from the 18th century. It was under these circumstances, in the province of Bengal, under the rule of the East India Company in the year 1772, that Raja Ram Mohan Roy was born. And he was lucky enough to be born in an enormously wealthy family of great privilege of upper-class Brahmins in India. He got the best education money could buy in the 18th century. In addition to the local languages of Bengali and Hindi, he learned the classical languages of the East, Sanskrit and Arabic, the languages of international trade, commerce, and diplomacy, English and Persian, the classical languages of the West, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and subjects like logic and philosophy and astronomy, and settled into his family occupation as a moneylender, lending mostly to Englishmen who were coming to India to work for the East India Company. Now, his fluency and facility with languages made him a voracious reader. And one of the books that he absolutely devoured from cover to cover was the Bible. He read it in its original languages, the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek, and he was completely enthralled by the stories, the parables, the teachings, the doctrines that he read. But most importantly, the central tenet that all human beings are created in the image of God and have equal dignity. This was a transformative moment in his life. This became his lodestar, the prism through which he saw everything else in the rest of his life. He turned his attention to his own religion. Hinduism, and he found it to be mired in idolatry. He proposed a reformed version of Hinduism, free of idolatry. He started to write articles, commentaries on scriptures. He started translating ancient Indian texts into English, and he became known very shortly as a great religious scholar in the region. But his interest in these topics was not just academic or theoretical or theological. He had a very practical application in mind. As he looked out and surveyed the landscape of 19th century India and the state of Hinduism at the time, there was a lot that he did not like, that troubled him. But three practices in particular he found to be morally repugnant and abhorrent, starting, of course, with the caste system. The caste system is this rigid, ritualized hierarchy of social status according to the caste of your birth, with the Brahmins at the very top and on through the rungs of the ladder. And at the very bottom are people known as Dalits, or untouchables. People so lacking dignity that when the Brahmins were around them, they would not even look at them to acknowledge their existence, much less interact with them. To Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was born a Brahmin, this was unspeakably cruel. But what bothered him even more was the practice of sati, or widow burning. Widows, usually young women, were coerced to climb onto the funeral pyres of their dead husbands, where they would die a painful, ghastly, agonizing, prolonged death, being burned alive, a practice that had deep roots in the Hindu tradition. Raja Ram Mohan Roy had first-hand experience, personal experience with this. His younger brother died suddenly, and his brother's wife committed sati, despite his best efforts to prevent it. What he also found deeply troubling and objectionable was the practice of child marriage, where girls as young as 4 and 5 would be married off to potential husbands by their parents. He thought of these three practices as deep and enduring stains on the fabric of India's civilization and of the Hindu religion. And he made it his purpose in life, his passion, to eradicate these practices, to stamp them out. And so he started to speak out against them, campaign against them, write articles against them. And in short order, he drew the wrath of his fellow countrymen. They were appalled by what they saw as a man attacking his own religion. They repudiated him, rejected him, renounced him, reviled him. They thought he was a turncoat, a backstabber. His family disowned him. But he continued, persisted, undeterred. He wanted to bring about an immense social change, a social transformation. But he knew that simply writing against it, speaking out against it, was not enough. A social transformation required a catalyst. And he knew that the catalyst that was needed to liberate India from the clutches of illiteracy and ignorance and credulity was education. And right around this time, there was a great debate brewing among the Englishmen who were concerned with the topic of modern education in India. And there were actually two camps opposed to each other: the Anglicists versus the Orientalists. The Anglicists versus the Orientalists. The Orientalists tended to be historians, scholars, classicists, linguists. They saw India as a great and ancient civilization with its own great and ancient language, Sanskrit. And they were convinced that Sanskrit had to be revived and had to become the language of education in India. The Anglicists tended to be merchants and missionaries, and they were, of course, convinced that English should be the medium of instruction. Raja Ram Mohan Roy came down firmly and unequivocally on the side of the Anglicists, contending that while, yes, Sanskrit was a great language, a great classical language, it was impractical as a means of modern education. And for India to fulfill its destiny as a successful and modern nation, it had to embrace English as the means of modern education. And so for the rest of his life, he became a fervent and ardent champion of English language education, seeking out allies wherever he could. In this cause, one such ally that he sought out was the Scottish merchant David Hare. Raja Ram Mohan Roy raised money, and the two of them together collaborated to start the Hindu College in the year 1817 in the city of Calcutta. Now, this was the first modern, and by modern I mean one that used modern textbooks from the 18th and 19th century as opposed to ancient textbooks, the first modern secular liberal arts institution in all of Asia. Nothing of the sort existed in the great nations of Asia at the time. It was also the first institution to admit boys of all religions, a rather radical and revolutionary thing for the time. And then a few years later, Ram Mohan Roy joined forces with a Scottish missionary named Alexander Duff to found the Scottish Church College in the year 1830 in the city of Calcutta. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, was the first college to admit women in all of Asia. Years, and in some cases even decades before similar institutions admitted women in the West. Now, while he was completely focused, completely preoccupied with this project of education reform, Raja Ram Mohan Roy had not forgotten about his central purpose, his central vision, his central mission in life, which was to stamp out those evil practices. And it just so happened that right around this time, there was a bill making its way through the British Parliament, a bill to ban the practice of sati. And all of a sudden, unexpectedly, there was intense opposition among Englishmen to this ban of sati. And in response to this, Ram Mohan Roy decided to undertake the long, difficult, and arduous journey at great personal cost and distress from India all the way to England to lobby the British Parliament to ban sati. Now you may ask, you may wonder, well, why were the Englishmen opposed to the ban on sati? I mean, after all, surely they saw this as an unacceptably gruesome practice. In order to answer that question, one must enter the mind of the 19th century Englishmen and understand how they thought. In their way of thinking, unlike the other English colonial possessions in Africa and the Caribbean, where when they found practices, native practices that they thought were barbaric and uncivilized and moved quickly to stamp them out and ban them, in India, they were confronted with what they saw as a great and ancient civilization equal to that of Rome and Greece, of equal antiquity and richness. And so while they were perfectly content with exploiting India economically, they were much more reluctant to intrude on what they saw as ancient practices of an ancient civilization, and hence the reluctance. But this was not good enough for Raja Ram Mohan Roy. During his stay in England, he visited the halls of Parliament and personally lobbied the British parliamentarians and the members of the Privy Council. And the argument he used was one from scripture. He said to them, the very scriptures that you venerate, that you say form the basis of your civilization, upon which you take the oath of office. Those very scriptures teach that all human beings have the same dignity. And if that is the case, why should a widow in Calcutta have less dignity than a widow in London? This was a powerful and persuasive argument, and it carried the day. The British Parliament ended up banning the practice of sati during his stay in England, an occasion that he celebrated with unhinged joy and glee, but one that was met with anger and indignation in India, especially among the upper classes. Now, this trip to England was a momentous one for Raja Ram Mohan Roy. His fame had preceded him. Articles were written about a great education reformer, religious reformer that he was. Politicians, activists, and reformers in England tripped over each other to meet him. But there was one group that he had an enormous impact on, and that was the earliest generation of English suffragettes, women, of course, who were agitating for their own rights in England. They were inspired by him, by his passion, his determination, his vision, his eloquence, his presence. And this is recounted in an old and out-of-print book, Ram Mohan Roy and the Making of Victorian Britain. This was an extraordinarily important trip for him. He had a jam-packed itinerary, but he found time to sit down for a portrait in London with the famous American painter, Rembrandt Peale. How many of you have heard of the famous 19th century American painter, Rembrandt Peale? Rembrandt Peale is famous for his portraits of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. But in this trip, there was one problem that hounded Raja Ram Mohan Roy persistently. You see, for all of his progressivism and modern ideas, in one respect, he was an unapologetic traditionalist, and that was in the matter of his diet, his food. He retained the strict, ritualistically strict vegetarian diet of a Brahmin. And of course, there was no such thing as a ritualistically strict vegetarian diet of a Brahmin in England at the time. And so he found it to be very difficult to find things to eat. As simple as that. And this predicament is perfectly illustrated in a dispatch that appeared in the Times of London in the year 1833. There was a banquet given in his honor by the East India Company. And the correspondent of the time notes rather wryly at the end of this dispatch, and I've magnified it, blown it up to make it easier to read. I'm going to quote from it. It was rather curious to see the Brahmin, which means Ram Mohan Roy, surrounded by hearty feeders upon turtle and venison and champagne, and touching nothing himself but rice and cold water. And of course, this had predictable consequences. His immune system degraded, he became sick, contracted infections, and ultimately died in the year 1833 in the city of Bristol, England. A monument was erected in his honor. Streets were named after him. And of course, that brings us to the statue that still stands there. The contemporary obituarist called him a radical religious reformer. But Ram Mohan Roy was much more than that. He was an unwavering champion of human rights and dignities, a man who fought for the betterment of society, for the upliftment of people, and of course, for the emancipation of women. And the social reforms and the educational reforms that he initiated rippled through the decades, impacting the lives of generations of Indians. And I'll give you one small example. The first woman to graduate with a law degree from Oxford University, the first female law graduate of Oxford University in England was not an English woman or an American woman or a Canadian woman or a European woman. She was a woman from Bombay, India. The recognition that eluded him in his lifetime because he was so reviled was bestowed on him by the government of India many, many decades after his death. The practices that he campaigned against are enshrined and banned in the Constitution of India. Today, it is a crime to even glorify the practice of sati. In due course, he has come to be recognized as perhaps the greatest social reformer of modern India, and a man who indisputably ushered in the era of modernity in India. And for that reason, he's called the father of modern India. Today, Raja Ram Mohan Roy's memory is cherished, his legacy is secure, and his statue stands tall, a testament to the incredible vision, passion, determination, and for the very purposeful life that he lived. Thank you.